The subject is Transcendent Consciousness, and we were comparing near-death experiences with spiritual contemplative experiences. And by spiritual contemplative experiences in the Christian tradition, it's mystical experiences. And this happens to people across different faith beliefs. It's not unique to Christianity. And as the presentation on Saturday that you heard discussed, it can happen across a broad group of faiths. So the outline of the presentation is, first we'll talk about the background, the objective of the research itself, and the conclusions. And I'll give you a break slide between each so you know where we're transitioning to the next topic. Now, as far as terminology is concerned, I want to be sure that when you hear these terms throughout the presentation, that you recognize what they are. Now, NDE is a pretty accepted term for near-death experiences. So science pretty much accepts this. And it has qualities of, and I highlight 4 attributes that we will get into in more detail in the presentation. And these attributes are similar to what I called, and I coined this term for the presentation, spiritual contemplative experiences. I did that mainly because you see NDE and SCE, you kind of feel like there's a connection in some way. But it would be more historically termed a mystical experience or something like that. And the attributes are basically out of space, out of time, a sense of unity, and a sense of the divine. And I'll go into that in more detail so we don't have to worry about it right now. Now, there are conferences that have talked about research. And it's amazing how these conferences do not cross-fertilize. You don't hear people talking about the same people. They're different groups of people. And I'm telling you about these conferences because this is a background for how this research came about. The first is the Mind and Life Institute, and I had been involved in that at the behest of Father Keating, who asked me to represent him and tell him whether there was a solid science there, and I felt that there was. I was thinking he's an advanced man. It's mainly Buddhist and dualistic. Now, the other conference actually was on brain death and disorders of consciousness, also secular, and this was, and I'll get into my involvement in that and how that led to this research. And then the 2 major religious, non-dualistic conferences are the Conference of Medicine and Religion, and this is sponsored by Harvard, University of Chicago, Institute for Spirituality and Health, in which I'm involved in here in Houston. It was held here in Houston twice. And the other one here is the European Conference on Religion, Spirituality and Health. And that's pretty much the counterpart to the US version. But there's some cross-fertilization. And having been involved in all of these, I can tell you that there isn't much cross-fertilization, which is kind of sad. In terms of the research on the effects of the healing effects of religion, the Bible on the subject is really the Handbook of Religion and Health, and Harold Koenig from Duke Medical Center was the editor, and it's a real big tome, and it's basically a compilation of all the research that's been done, and it kept current. He's out of Duke. The religious research is mainly in 3 categories. If you have a faith belief, and these are just some examples that come out of his handbook, okay? If you have a faith belief, then you have there's an improved sense of well-being if you have a faith belief. If you have a church attendance regularly, and I'm not talking about specific churches, once a week, you can live up to 7 years longer. And if you have a prayer practice, a regular prayer practice, there could be healing from that. This particular piece of research here was done by a medical doctor out of Mississippi, and I helped with it. I didn't do the research, but I helped negotiate the agreement with Baylor College of Medicine to have this done. And there was a strong correlation of prayer and lessening of depression. Now that I ended with that religious research and ended with prayer, there are two types of prayer. You'll probably recognize some of these. Discursive, cataphatic, contemplative, apophatic. Discursive is obviously with thoughts that are engaged in your imagination, guided meditation. The other is contemplative prayer, which is an example of centering prayer. These two types are shared by all faiths. Centering prayer facilitates contemplative or mystical prayer and can lead to SCE, spiritual contemplative experience. And I went through the guidelines, which some of you have heard now, but I went through the guidelines, and that is as to what this centering prayer is, okay? You take a sacred symbol, you choose a word or image as an intention to be with God. You sit in a comfortable position and introduce the symbol of God's presence. And when thoughts come, and you become aware of or engaged in the thoughts, you return to the sacred symbol, which is a symbol of your desire to be with God. And then there's a gentle readjustment, pulling away from the scene, basically. Now, this was explained, I'm explaining this so that you have an idea of where the research, what it was based on. Now, this is an interesting story that I want to share with you. Can you hear me without the speaker right here?
Yeah.
Okay. But you're right in front. I find this to be an interesting story, and how God works in guiding us. And I'm always trying to walk through doors where God asks me to walk through, but who knows? I first experienced the correlation between SCE and NDE when I taught 10 people centering prayer. And 3 of those people, at the end of the first 20-minute sit, started to talk to each other and tell each other that they had just relived a near-death experience they had previously in their life. Now, I had never run into that before. I've seen a lot of things happen when we practice centering prayer, but that was a new one on me. And I was a fly on the wall watching them discuss this. And it was amazing how their eyes popped out. They had relived it. And they talked to each other and related to each other. So I knew there was a connection. And it's really the unloading of the unconscious. There's a symbol of an iceberg there, because 90+% of the iceberg is below the water. That's symbolic of the unconscious. The conscious is the little bit that's above the water. And in centering prayer, since you're letting go of your thoughts gently, you're leaving room in the conscious brain for the unconscious brain to unload. So that's what happens sometimes with these experiences that I observed in teaching it. Now, that was an explanation of what happened when I was teaching centering prayer, this unloading of the unconscious. Now, that unloading of unloading to the conscious brain, I've seen that in PTSD patients. Teaching 10 people, one person came back to me 3 months later. I ran into him, and I said, "Well, how is it going?" And he said, "Well, I had a problem." I said, "Well, what was it?" And he said, "Well, during the prayer practice, I remembered exactly what happened to me in Vietnam." Now, he didn't tell me the details, but it was clearly a PTSD issue. And I said to him, well, what did you do? And he said, I ever so gently let it go and returned to God. The divine healer was healing him. The divine healer recognized that with his practice of centering prayer, letting go of thoughts and returning to God constantly, he was now ready to let go of that PTSD thought and let it go gently. I told this to the head of the psychiatric department of Baylor because we were both at the time on the board of the Institute for Spirituality and Health. His eyes popped out. He said, we don't know how to treat PTSD. I said, the divine healer does it. So that was really the unconscious unloading. But then when I experienced it teaching 10 people, 3 of them were unloading their near-death experience, I was stunned. And I stored that in the back of my mind, having experienced that in them reliving it. Statistically, 98, 99% of near-death experiences are very pleasant and wonderful. There are a few that aren't, but they're very much in the minority. So then I was invited to go to Cuba. And this is a story in and of itself, and I don't want to bore you, but stories to me give a sense of where these things come from, how God inspires us. I met a fellow Catholic deacon in Miami at a conference, a contemplative conference. And when he understood that I taught a graduate course on faith and science at the University of St. Thomas, he said, would you come to Cuba and teach the deacons? Give presentations, not the whole course. And I said, okay. So I went to, I prepared in 2014, I made the preparations to go to Cuba legally through the Treaty on Intellectual Exchange. It's a legal way of doing it. I got there, and there were about, Cuba has about 85 Catholic deacons, and there were about 30 there. And 2 or 3 were medical doctors, so there was some, it was an eclectic group. And a lady who was not there came up to me later, and she said, would you present this to the University of Havana? And being a loving deacon, I said, are you out of your mind? It's an atheist school. It was originally a Dominican university. Castro took it over. Atheist school now. And she said, no, I think they're ready. Now, she was the only person who taught both at the University of Havana and at the Seminario, which had to be called the Seminario because it was illegal to call it the Catholic University. And so I said, okay, just tell me where and when. And so the teaching of the deacons was actually the first week in January of 2015. And when I got there, the Cubans were all excited because it had just been announced that détente was just announced. And so they thought money was going to flow in, okay? But I wasn't there for that purpose. But when she approached me, I said, well, when do you want to do this? And she said, well, June of 2015, which was only 4 months away, roughly. Yeah, 5 months away. And I said, okay. So then I realized this was bigger than Bob. So I gathered some, through my network at the Institute, some people together to go. So there would be 3 or 4 of us presenting. And one of them was the Baylor College Medicine head of the fMRI, Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging layout, who did the research with that Mississippi man I was telling you about. So he presented that research. And so she said, I'll do my best to do this. And I said, okay, you just tell me where and when. Well, I had to talk all these people into paying their own way. I couldn't fund them all. So we had a real powerful group. There were 3 or 4 people there. So she was not able to pull it off. So now it's at the Seminario, not at the University of Havana. I said, okay. So this time the public was invited to come. And at the end of the presentation, which included neuroscience And I'm not a neuroscientist, but that man from Baylor was. And in fact, I headed up a tour group, and they showed interest in coming. And when he did, then it dawned on me, this is perfect. He's the guy I need there. That's how God was working. I didn't specifically go to appoint him or, encourage him to do it. So when he, so we get there, we do it at the seminario. And at the end of the presentation, a gentleman sitting in the audience with his wife approaches me, and he says, I'm Dr. Calixto Machado, and I'm head of the neuroscience department of the medical center in Cuba. And he said, would you come back and give this, and talk about religion and health, neuroscience of it, etc., at my conference, which is going to be in December. And the conference is on the disorders of consciousness. That was that second conference. And as a good, loving deacon, my answer was, are you totally out of your mind? And he said, no, I want you there. And it was an international conference that he plans, and it was in English. People from all over the world came, and he dedicated a whole day to religion and health. Now I knew this was even bigger than, not only bigger than Bob, but bigger than the team I had in June. Now I had to go really big, because this was going to be historic. This was the first time that religion was going to be taught at a public university in Cuba since the revolution 56 years before. And I thought, boy, this is something else. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do here, but I said, okay. So this time I got Harold Koenig, the author of that book, to do a keynote speech. He couldn't come down, but he did it on a video that I took down. So he provided the keynote speech. I had another keynote speaker, a psychologist who's very well known, and then a presenter from the Pontifical University of Rome, the same guy that came from Baylor College of Medicine. We had a solid team, and we spent the whole day. And then Calixto, during the, right before the start of it, said to me, he said, well, I think you ought to teach century prayer. And as a loving deacon, I said, are you out of your mind? And he said, no, I think you should. I said, okay. I'm just doing what I'm asked to do, that's all. And this time his daughter, who's also an MD neuroscientist, invited her fellow neuroscientists to come to a breakout session, and we taught it. Now when I say we, teaching this is a subtlety of language that's important. And since the conference was in English, I could have given it in English, but I didn't want to risk the subtlety of the words. So I remembered that the chairman of Contemplative Outreach, which was retired chairman of the Contemplative Outreach, which was formed by 3 Trappist monks, was actually a priest in Havana. So I called him. So he's an expert teacher. I said, can you come over to this conference and teach this? And he said, yes. So I gave the science of it. Then he presented it in Spanish. We recorded it. It's on the YouTube site that you saw in the first slide. I'll bring that slide back. And at the end of the first 20-minute sit, Janine, who's Calixto's daughter, has a profound mystical experience. Now, I've seen this very rarely, but complete out-of-body, and she proceeds to tell her fellow neuroscientists what just happened. Now, there are plenty of holy people throughout the centuries in my tradition, saints, that talk about out-of-body experiences, talk about these profound mystical experiences. And we sometimes think that, oh, that's a historical thing. It still happens. It still happens. And you should have seen the look on those neuroscientists' faces. Their jaws dropped. absolutely jaws dropped. So this was the backdrop, and she tells her father what happened. And he's a neuroscientist, profound, one of the world's experts on bringing people out of coma. There was a young black teenager in California that they declared dead, but the mother felt she was still alive. They invited him up to see her. So he flies around the world, even though he lives in Havana. He's world renowned for bringing people out of coma. So I approached him. It dawned on me, my experience from those 10 people, remember? I said to him, have you had many of your patients talk about near-death experiences? And he said, all the time. Now the scientist in me starts climbing across the table, basically, and saying, are you kidding me? You've got brain scans of people that had near-death experiences? He says, well, I don't know that it was actually when they were having the experiences. Now, by the way, these are very rare. Both the near-death and the spiritual contemplative experiences are very rare. So I don't want you to think that if you do centering prayer, you're going to get this, because that's not the purpose. I want to be sure we know that. But this is a transcendent state between this world and the next. As people that are believing in God, we should be interested in this, right? So, why are we interested in it? Well, in NDE there's a paranormal, there are 4 attributes that are shared by both. There's a paranormal out-of-body experience. You've heard this, read this, people will look down on their own bodies. Okay. Well, in spiritual contemplative experiences of ecstasy, people don't look back on their own bodies because they're not dead, but my experience is that they rise above the room. I don't mean actually floating, okay? I'm not talking about levitation. What I'm talking about is the mental image that they have, even though their feet are still on the ground and they're high, okay? Very similar. There's a timelessness to the near-death experiences, a sense of timelessness, in spiritual contemplative experiences, they might feel like prayer was only 2 or 3 minutes long, but it was basically an hour or whatever. And so that's Salvador Dali's painting of the clock melting. When Einstein started to research this space-time, Dali picked up on it. But the third is an effective peace, okay, that is experienced in near-death experiences, and there's a sense of wholeness or perfection that people will talk about when they have a profound mystical or spiritual contemplative experience. There's a transcendent state of sensing the divine or the spiritual in near-death. And there is a sense of oneness that people will report when they have mystical experiences. And there's a gradation scale that science has accepted now. Science didn't accept near-death experiences very well. I mean, it took science a while to say, hey, this is not just a malady, there's something going on here. And there are a lot more attributes than these, that are defined in the Grayson scale, which is science's accepted scale for measuring whether somebody had a legitimate near-death experience. And these 4 attributes are in that scale. There are other parts to it, but these are kind of core attributes. So, I say to Calixto, Calixto says to me, he said, well, even though I don't know when they were having the near-death experience, if you want to do research on this, which I was suggesting to him, he said, well, all we have to do is get them to remember these experiences. Well, not being a neuroscientist, I was a little bit apprehensive about that. I wasn't sold on it. But this PTSD patient we talked about is a good example where neuroscientists believe that if you're remembering these things, a lot of the same mental things happen to the brain, okay? And so it's not an absolute certainty that it's going to duplicate the experience, but when you're remembering it, it has a very similar pattern from what he was telling me. And I believed him. He's a neuroscientist, I'm not. So the research motivations to compare these two were interfaiths describe both and have done so for centuries. You look at in my tradition, the Catholic tradition, the saints, it's all over history, every century. And again, very rare, but the ones that are rare are the saints reporting it quite often, like Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, using poetry because the description of what happened is beyond words. The second is these conferences needed to cross-fertilization and could be benefited by this kind of research. The next is the religious people of the world. In the US, it's 87% of the population believes in God and in transcendence to the next life, are interested in and should be interested in this transcendence which both of these experiences point to. Medicine debates bioethics in defining death. They're still debating it. This is an interesting implication. People have reported reliving of NDE as SCE. I told you about that earlier. Neuroscientists see consciousness neural correlates. And science recognizes similar NDE and SCE attributes. I just talked about that. So, the research objective was this. Compare neural correlates of remembering NDE and SCE. This is the first time a direct comparison has been made between the two. And to me, that was intriguing because I was surprised nobody had done it before. Nobody at that conference had done anything like this. The results would hopefully shed light on the motivations of the study. Okay. The researchers, I put my name last originally. Calixto gave me hell about it. So since I'm presenting this at the conference, I relented. But the one who really did the research was Calixto. And Janine, his daughter, was involved. And her husband, who's also a neuroscientist, was involved. Harold Koenig and Andrew Newberg. Andrew Newberg did MRI scans of Franciscan nuns that practiced centering prayer. So he's been involved with this for some time. And so these are top-notch people. And Ramiro Salas was the one who did the discursive research at Baylor. So we had the people, the right people. But the main person was Calixto with the help of his daughter and son-in-law, her husband. Okay, what was the research? What did we do? Well, the first thing was to pick a tool. Now, Calixto was starting to see that it was important to get both spatial and temporal results. In other words, spatial meaning where in the brain it happened, and temporal meaning how quick it happened. And some of these tools are known for different benefits. And this is a graph, if you can see the lines of spatial on the x-axis and temporal on the bottom axis. So the one that he wanted to use, and we did, was the QEEGT. Now, I had not heard of this before, but it's quantitative electroencephalographic tomography. It's basically the same as EEG, only there's a method for applying, for using that enhances both the spatial and the temporal, okay? And he uses a Loretta method for the pathophysiological brain mechanisms, okay? So he knows how to do this, okay? So the question was, where are we going to get the subjects? Okay, well, it was right there in front of us. Number one, he had the NDE subjects. He went back to all his patients that he knew told him about an NDE experience. So all they had to do is go back to them and apply the Grayson scale, which is a handwritten scale. They fill in, did you, this happen, did you feel this, did you know. And then when it came to the SCE, he said, well, I don't know how to contact these people. I said, we've got Father Walker right here in Nevada. He's taught it. He was former chairman of that organization. And so he could identify those people that had those. Now, normally, if a person has these, they don't want to talk about it. There are 5 reasons that people don't talk about it. I've come up with these 5. 1, people think they're nuts. 2, the memory of it starts to slip away after it happens. 3, words are not adequate. 4, people might feel like, oh gosh, he or she must be holy, which is not necessarily the case. God loves us all. He comes when we need him. And 5, they may try to seek it, which is wrong. It's a gift. So basically, got in touch with Father Walker, and his students that he had taught it to were obviously willing to share it with him because he was a local priest. And then he talked them into working on this research. They did a neurological exam of CAT scan and MRI to eliminate subjects with brain damage. They took the resting state, which is important in science. You've got to have a resting state to establish the baseline. We put together a guided meditation, which was a verbal way of, and a standardized way of facilitating their remembering. So once we got them to the remembering point, we shut up and then they just remembered their experience. And the memory scans were done with QEEGT during remembering NDE and SCE. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, okay? But basically, the gamma frequency was used and shown a correlation. This is the baseline. And remember NDE, remember SCE, and you can see they light up more. And it showed a activation and a correlation. Did it in the alpha frequency, 3D reconstructed to show that the same thing happened. Both NDE and SCE, but it was greater with SCE, and that's happening on all of these. The greater impact on the brain scans is coming from SCE mystical experiences, not necessarily near-death experiences. They looked at the delta frequency in both the right and left temporal lobes, with greater in the right hemisphere, yet overall greater for spiritual contemplative experiences. Frontal lobes, which is a seat for, it plays a key role, frontal lobes play a key role in moral decisions. Not that the whole brain isn't involved, but there have been examples of when people didn't have their frontal lobes, they couldn't make right moral decisions. And there was increased activation in the frontal lobes, but was again greater for SCE. So what were the conclusions? The conclusions were there was a significant QEEGT correlation across broad frequency ranges between NDE and SCE. This is consistent with the common Grayson scale attributes of both. Most frequencies were higher for SCE, consistent with fact subject was not dying, with the fact that the subject was not dying. And I think that's probably the reason, I'm conjecturing here, that the spiritual contemplative experiences, the person wasn't dying at the time. Okay. Gamma frequencies implied greater cognitive activity, alpha greater concentration, delta greater memory, frontal activations implied greater attentiveness. Now, like any study, there are limitations. The limitations here is there's no assurance that the remembering is going to be the same as the original experience. And the other is the small number of subjects results in a lower statistical significance. but it's certainly, that's why we called it preliminary conclusions. It begs for further study, let's put it that way. So what were we looking at? We were looking at NDE and SCE, and we're not the first to talk about these. Near-death experiences, Raymond Moody was probably the classic, he was the classic first one to talk about them, and talked about these attributes, okay, Dr. Raymond Moody. Then, even earlier, William James described the spiritual and mystical experiences and their attributes in the varieties of religious experience in 1902. So this has been known for some time, but science never really focused in on it. Okay. So here, based on previous writings, there was correlation already. And again, the interest in my own personal interest is, as I get older, are we together on this? This transcendence to the next life is important. And as a scientist, I'm interested in it and wonder if I can learn anything about what God's trying to tell me. But these are two transcendent events. There's actually a third transcendent event. We didn't study it, but I gotta tell you, I've never seen this third transcendent event correlated with these two. This is the singularity at the beginning of the Big Bang. Now, I end this talk with this just as a kind of a tweak in our thinking, okay, just to kind of keep us on the toes and see where we go from here. Einstein and his theories led to these attributes of the singularity. It's dimensionless because it's basically, they first thought the singularity was a baseball or a softball, then a golf ball, and now as small as a photon, essentially no matter. Look like at that. Does that look similar? It's timeless. There's no light at the singularity, so there's no time. Does that look similar? Peace, perfection, ordered. Entropy in the second law of thermodynamics says that entropy is a measure of disorder in the universe, and the second law says that it's always increasing. At the singularity, entropy is zero. It's perfectly ordered. Wow. Shouldn't this be a transcendent event between this world and the next, when that was the birth of the universe from that other world? Finally, oneness, unification. Well, Einstein unified four forces. He actually only knew about two, but the unified theory he started with shows that the forces are all unified at that singularity. So quite often people will talk about a sense of oneness in the universe when they speak of these experiences. Aren't they all drawing us to that sense of oneness in the universe? So that's a kind of a symbol of the Big Bang, and the singularity is at the beginning. And that we are experiencing the same thing in this experience. I think this is profound, and there was a lot of interest at this conference because they had never approached it this way. Not trying to pat ourselves on the back, but it was just a fascinating approach to them. So where do we go from here? Preliminary conclusions encourage the expanded study of more subjects. This tool is very useful. This best resolution for complex states of consciousness for future studies. There is application in palliative care, because though there are people who fear death, and if they could practice centering prayer, get a sense of the peace that really awaits them, it would lessen their fear of death. I think there's use for this in the centering prayer as lessening fear of that end of life care. And this conference does not focus on the clinical that much. So I'm trying to get them to bring the conference here. I can't offer them Interlaken or, ritzy places like that. But every other year they have it in Phoenix. And every other year they have it in a place like next one up is Banff. So I told them I can't offer any of those, but I said, instead of Phoenix, why don't you come here? So we're working on that. And then encouraging collaborative research, interdisciplinary cooperation for future studies. And I offered to have them contact me if they were interested. So